Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host and your friend Rashid, and I'd like to thank our guest for coming on, Dr. Gilbert Doctorow. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of the Red Pill Diaries, sir.
Oh, pleasure to join you.
Let's get started. We see the dallying back and forth between the U.S., NATO, and Ukraine. Now they're saying that Zelensky is refusing to cede any territory, but common sense tells me that if the United States is supplying Ukraine with most of its weapons, if the intelligence agencies are embedded with CIA and MI6, if the military is coordinated with the MI6 and NATO and the CIA, and if the United States is funding the government of Ukraine, it's not really Zelensky's the person that has the final say in everything. Why is the media leading us to believe that Zelensky calls the shots?
Common sense is a very rare commodity these days. I think it's very fortunate that we are getting together today because a number of things happened today, two in particular, which I hope we can discuss, which changed my prognostication of the timeline for the end of this war, shortened it dramatically. Although it keeps intact, I've said very few predictions that worked out. But about this war, in that sense, I don't feel any sense of shame because over almost everyone else in on this act has also been wrong-footed regularly. A war that could have ended in 1 week, as some people thought or set out, is now entering its fourth year. And every few months, analysts who are well regarded by your audience, and some of whom have appeared on your show, have been telling us that victory is just around the corner, that the war will end, it's a Russian victory, it's a Ukrainian and then a NATO defeat, and just stand by and we can watch it crash. And every time that they have made these predictions, and I joined that group, I don't put myself aside from them, I've also been repeatedly expecting an end to the war because military logic dictated that, although military logic has been totally overruled by propaganda purposes. And so each time it looked like the end was coming, it moved away like the horizon. So today I'm going to make yet another prediction, but I don't expect to be wrong-footed because the signs are very clear that the end is near for Mr. Zelensky and his regime. And the only thing that I've said over the last 3 years, which I think stands out compared to so many other analysts, is I have predicted that this war will end by political collapse of Ukraine and not by a classic military defeat where where the lines crumble, everyone runs away, and there's total disorder. That's not going to happen. But what will happen is a political collapse, and it's just in front of our eyes. And let me shock your audience because the largest group or contingent of audiences for these alternative media programs have a very low opinion of Mr. Trump. Well, I'd say alternative media. If you look at mainstream, the predominant view of Trump is that he's a moron. He's too old. He's lost it. There are all sorts of things said about him. They're dead wrong. I am stunned at the man's ability at duplicity. I mean, I've been had by him, and I thought I was pretty sharp at picking these things up. I've been enthusiastic for him. I'm disappointed for him. Back in his first term, I called for his impeachment at one point, and I have even a week ago saying that I'm writing that Trump disappoints because when the Geneva meetings were held just a week ago, and the Ukrainians were invited to modify the 28-point plan that had originally been concocted by Witkoff and the Russian emissary for Mr. Putin, um, it was all undone in Geneva, and everyone, the American participants, Witkoff and uh, Dan Driscoll, and of course Rubio, smiled, said it was a very productive meeting. At that point, I thought, my goodness, this really is going off in an absurd direction, and Mr. Trump is let me down. And at that point, I said that Mr. Putin had made a wrong bet, betting on improved relations with the United States instead of betting on fighting like hell to finish off Ukraine as quickly as possible. Well, I eat my words. Easier than eating my hat, but I eat my words. I'm stunned at what seems to be developing. This is not conclusive, but it is directional and I'd say very persuasive that Trump is behind the procedures now being applied to Yermak, who was really the most powerful man in the Zelensky gang, the man who was in charge of personnel, a very, very influential individual. And his removal in a corruption scandal will by itself be the downfall of Zelensky. But considering that he is being attacked, it is just a matter of days before Zelensky is brought in on corruption charges. So, and who was behind all this? Donald Trump. I've been asked about this. I had an interview this morning. A very competent Indian broadcaster in English was speaking about it as if this is something just happened. the anti corruption unit in Kiev, well, it just happened to bring in Yermak. Well, that is very nice, but it is missing the point. That body was kept in power because of the intervention of the United States. Intervention of the United States means Donald Trump. What is happening now, that Yermak has been called in, after he was sent down by Zelensky as Ukraine's chief negotiator and negotiated with the American team. And days later, his house has been raided, and it's clear that there are going to be charges against him. Now, who could be doing this? Donald Trump, no question. And that what happened in Geneva was political theater. They were setting it up for the downfall of the Zelensky regime. Now, if Zelensky is under charges and is forced to resign, there's nobody to replace him. There will be a power vacuum in Ukraine. And perhaps the United States has a man to fill the slot. Arestovich was a former advisor to Zelensky, who had a falling out with him and got on a plane fast enough to reach the United States before he could be put in prison in Ukraine. And he has been making very logical and reasonable statements about ending the war and conceding defeat and moving on while he's in the States. So he could be a candidate for this. Or that's as a temporary fill-in pending an election which could be 30, 60, 90 days from now. In any case, I see the end of this. It is not an endless war. I have written one volume and published one volume called War Diaries, which is a collection of my writings every few days on my Substack platform, and of the interviews that I've given. These materials were published in May of this year. I forecast there would be another volume. Now, the manuscript is so big that it's really 2 volumes will be coming in the first quarter of next year. And I was afraid this is going to be a whole library. Now, I would like this war to end as much as most of everyone in your audience surely wants to do. It has tilted us towards World War III. We all are not just bystanders, but we could be the object of the next war if this gets out of hand. And so its ending sooner than rather than later is to the great advantage of all of us, the audience, the whole country, the States, and Western Europe in particular.
Um, you say a power vacuum would happen with the removal of Zelensky, but do you think Russia would allow the United States to replace Zelensky, or will they put their man in power in this power vacuum, the same way that the United States placed their men in power when Yanukovych was removed? Would Russia risk allowing the United States to continue to run Ukraine?
Well, the question of relations between Ukraine and Russia are widely misunderstood, but the ambitions of Russia is not to rule Ukraine. It is for Ukraine to be a neutral country, as was the original understanding when the Soviet Union broke up, that it would not join any military blocs, meaning NATO. It would be a neutral country with a modest size military, and it would be non-nuclear. All of these facts were written down immediately after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And of course, in the constitution of independent Ukraine, it was written that it would be a neutral country. It was only after the Orange Revolution, the various regime change operations, which the United States, through its NGOs in Ukraine, it implemented, going back to 2004, the changes were made in the Ukrainian constitution, which not allowed for, but actually foresaw membership in NATO and Ukraine being used as an instrument to beat Russia. So the idea, going back to who was Yanukovych, oh yes, that he was the Russian candidate. He wasn't at all. He was a bitter pill for the Russians. There were no all Russian candidates in Ukraine. Yanukovych wanted to be in the middle. He did not want to join the EU because he foresaw the economic ruin of Ukraine, the deindustrialization. Ukraine didn't produce anything manufactured that would be of value to the EU. It would just be a source of agricultural commodities. Whereas in its relationship to Russia, it was a major supplier of military subassemblies. It manufactured various military hardware that had been the property of the Soviet Union, not of the Russian Federation as such. So it provided engines for Russian naval vessels. It was integrated into Russian manufacturing, and it served a purpose. In the EU, it served no purpose. All of its measures, all of its industrial standards would have to be changed, and disrupting entirely all the production facilities. So he foresaw economic ruin for the country. Moreover, the cooperation agreement that was offered to Ukraine in the autumn of 2013 was before the coup in February of 2014, all had within it secret provisions. The secret provisions were essentially bringing Ukraine into NATO. It had to align its foreign policy and its defense policy with EU, which would mean aligning it against Russia. So the hope of it maintaining neutrality and being a bridge between East and West was crushed by the EU as it courted Yanukovych. It didn't make any progress there. He was offered, I think, a 16 billion euro loan by Russia to stay afloat. And at that point, the Maidan was brought into existence. Maidan is the name of a square, Independence Square in Kiev. But that name was given to the whole resistance movement to the so-called Russian regime in Kiev. There wasn't a Russian regime. Yanukovych came from the part of the country that was basically Russian-speaking. That's all you could say. Russian-speaking does not mean ethnically Russian, by the way. It means you're a Russian speaker, period. And that didn't necessarily mean that you were disloyal to Ukraine. However, the country was taken over in early 2014 from the coup d'etat was taken over by ardent Ukrainian nationalists who wanted to stamp out every trace of Russian culture and any possible allegiance or interest in or sympathy for Russia in the broad population. That was the past. But speaking about the present, though, I do not see Russia having any interest in running Ukraine. Anyone who runs Ukraine now is going to have to invest a fortune to revive Ukraine. When the EU says very blithely we want them to join, and who's going to pay for it? This will take several hundred billion euros to bring Ukraine back from the dead. The whole civilian infrastructure has been destroyed by the Russians. And so ruled Ukraine, the Russians are very happy to see the EU integrate Ukraine and take on the vast costs. It's improbable that they will join the EU because several member countries understand that it would be destructive of their agricultural industry. Ukraine is a large country with very big agriculture. For example, poultry, raising chickens. Until a few years ago, a couple of years ago, the Ukrainian chickens were driving the French chicken farmers out of business. Such French chicken farmers had maybe a few thousand chickens, and the Ukrainian farms had a few million chickens. So just as an example, that's France. Poland, of course, is terrified at the Ukrainian agriculture entering the EU. So Hungary, the same story. The cost of production in Ukraine is much lower, and that will ruin the respective sectors of the economy in these European countries. So that's a separate issue. But Russia has no interest in ruling a country or the rump Ukraine, what's left after this separation of the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine from the Ukraine that existed in 1992. Russia does not want to run the Ukrainian parts, the Ukrainian nationalist and only Ukrainian-speaking parts of the country, because they are hostile and their stay there would be very expensive to Russia in every way.
So does that mean that Russia is going to take Kiev and Odessa? Because those are Russian-speaking areas and are historically related to Russia.
They are. You're correct. That's not the only part of Ukraine that's historically related to Russia and is still held by Ukraine as opposed to Russia occupied. The second largest city in the country, Kharkiv, is in the northeast of the country, and that is also entirely a Russian-speaking city. But nobody's talking about Russia grabbing it. Kiev, it's a question. If it's going to be the capital of Ukraine, then of course the Russians aren't going to take it. The Odessa is a different story. It is, if the war continues, Russians will certainly take Odessa. Not because it's Russian speaking, which it is, but because it is of great strategic value to the French and the British, and its remaining in Ukrainian hands would give them a continued interest in Ukraine as an instrument to be used against Russia. The port of Odessa is very close to the Crimea. It is a good staging ground for attacks on Crimea and for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is based in Crimea. So if Ukraine loses Odessa, it would lose much of its interest and appeal to the French and the British, who are the biggest, loudest interveners in this war, seeing the opportunity to strike against the strategic interests of Russia. The British, of course, are the single biggest actors in sabotage, in creating false flag operations in Russia and in the Ukraine, for purposes of discrediting Moscow. If you had to look at who the Russians blame for the war reaching the intensity it has now, it is first and foremost the Brits. That is what Boris Johnson did in March, April of 2022, when he visited and persuaded Zelensky not to implement the initial peace agreement from Istanbul that the Russians and Ukrainian delegations had reached. It is well. So, as I say, the Brits are the single biggest headache for the Russians.
Well, wouldn't it make strategic sense to nip it all in the bud and take Odessa? That way, it can take the appeal away, and Russia won't be fighting this war again in 5 years after Ukraine is rearmed and Ukraine decides to move closer and closer to the EU. And it would also, at the same time, provide a land bridge to Transnistria, and Russia would not have to go through rump Ukraine to reach its peacekeeping troops in Transnistria.
You're making a very strong argument. Of course, there are many defenders of Russia, both inside the country and in the West, in the alternative media, who are saying exactly what you just said. On the other hand, there's another side to the picture. The Russian objective, is to conclude a peace, not with Ukraine as such, but with Europe and the United States. The designs of Mr. Putin from the beginning, from December of 2021, when his deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Ryabkov, pushed across the table to NATO and to Washington the demands, move back the NATO installations to where they were in 1997 before NATO expanded into Eastern Europe, or we will push you back. That issue remains the primary interest of Moscow. They want a definitive reordering of the security architecture in Europe, which brings Russia in from the cold and puts an end to the kind of confrontation that would make the provisions that you were describing important and necessary. You don't have to control Odessa if there's no enemy, if nobody is arming Ukraine. That is one of the conditions that the Russians have set for peace. That all sides agree that their differences are resolved once and for all time, and they are not going to make claims against one another for war crimes, and they are not going to continue to harbor hopes of changing the borders. If that is arrived at, and that is the Russians' preferred end to this war, not just de facto end of fighting and de facto occupying what they take. If they achieve that, and together with Mr. Trump, it is not unreasonable to expect they will achieve that, then there is no rearming of Ukraine by Western Europe. It won't happen. Ukraine will not need an army to fight Russia, and the Europeans will not be allowed to intervene and to help set up such preconditions for restarting the war.
But again, if Russia takes a deal like that, they would be risking war once again. They will put some of their national security in the hands of the very people who caused the war in the first place. Because remember, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, once said that America is agreement incapable. And America has gone back on all of its agreements and treaties and everything else. Not 1 inch east, remember that, by NATO, not 1 inch east. And now they're up on Russia's borders. So I would think that would be naive for a president to accept that and because any other U.S. president could come right in and change that agreement or just throw the agreement out the window as they did with the Minsk one, the Minsk two, and use it to rearm and re-strategize and reposition. Because I say the United States and the West, the only time they like to negotiate is when they need to rest, rearm, and reconstitute, and then recalibrate their positions. And I think that Russia, it would almost be foolish for Russia to leave Odessa in this way, because, as you said before, Odessa, the taking of Odessa would remove any strategic thoughts from France, the EU, and the UK vis-a-vis the Black Sea against Russia.
Well, there are no illusions anymore. In the period that you're describing, when Russia was had by the West, by Bush, and then by Clinton's, there were illusions, at least until 1998, that Russia could be integrated into the Western-dominated world, and that all would be friends. And there was no need for there to be confrontation in the future. That, of course, ended in 1998. The United States role and the NATO role in destroying Serbia put an end to all such illusions. Today there are no illusions, and if there are possibilities of verification, and if there are violations of this, who is going to have the upper hand? Russia. Russia has the arms. Russia has the Oreshniks. Russia is 10 years ahead of the United States and the West in many important conventional as well as nuclear weapons. Their ability to rectify the situation by utterly crushing Kiev at any moment means that they don't have to trust anybody. But let's look at the question of trust. It's very easy to be cynical about this. Trust was underlying all of the treaties on non-proliferation and on limitation of various strategic and non-strategic weapon systems, all of which except the START agreement on strategic nuclear arms on triads, that is, or delivery systems for nuclear nuclear bombs, whether they be airplanes or submarines or ground launched. The numbers of warheads that you could have, those are also, they were treasured by all sides, these agreements, because they kept the arms race under control. They brought down dramatically the number of warheads that each side had, so you could only destroy the world like 10 or 20 times over instead of 1,000 times over. But what were they all about? The limitation of numbers, from my take, is the least of it. What they were about is constant verification visits, an exchange of delegations, of experts who knew one another on a first name basis, and they developed some trust with one another. Leave the level of presence out of this. The people who were implementing these arms limitation agreements established some trust, enough trust for us to have survived the period from 1962 up to present. Now there's no trust. And as I say, we can be cynical, but it works against our own interests. I'm saying our, I mean, in the case of this Russian interests. You don't have to be naive, but you should not be cynical either. Without some level of trust, we're going to go to hell.
So, do you think that Russia and the U.S. are communicating behind closed doors? And do you believe that at this time, President Vladimir Putin can accept anything other than the taking of these Russian lands because he also has to play to a domestic audience. Also, a lot of people always talk about Trump and the neocons and America's domestic audience, and they often leave out that that Vladimir Putin also has demands on him from his domestic audience, and there's so much Russian blood that has been shed, and for them to give up their military positions at this point would be almost tantamount to treason.
Um, I understand your point, and I appreciate that some of your argument is coming from people who believe they know what the Russian people want. Unfortunately, that understanding what Russian people want, in the case of the people who are making these statements, is from meeting with high military officers and with other high officials of the Russian government. I'm sorry, if you were to go to Washington and meet with people in the Pentagon and meet with some senators, and then come out and say that you know what the Russian people, what the American people want, I think you would be subjected to very severe criticism.
Hmm.
I do not say that I understand better than they do what the Russian people want, but I will say that it's a very complicated issue, and Russians are war weary. You say blood. The problem with the drone warfare and the nature of this war has changed over time and has become a very influential factor. Is no longer artillery, where you're instantly blown to little pieces if you happen to be in the wrong place when it lands, but drone warfare, where you might have a chance of just losing a few limbs and still being viable. Unfortunately, there are a lot of Russians coming back to be treated for uh, lost limbs, being fitted with prostheses. And that gets out in the public. People know about it. So even if Russia only lost 150,000 only, America lost 65,000 dead in Vietnam. Russians are estimated to have lost at least 150,000 dead. And you can multiply that by 4 or 5 times to understand the number of casualties who no longer are fit for the military because they've been so severely wounded. And those are with the amputations. So the Russia doesn't have cemeteries that have exploded in size the way Ukraine does, but it has a lot of hospitals, military hospitals, filled with severely wounded men. Um, and that gets out, and so people are war weary. It's a country of 145 million. Well, now it's probably, with the increase of Ukrainian territory, it's probably 155 million people. And to think that any of us from the West coming in for 1 week, 2 weeks, maybe 1 year or 2 years, can get our arms around that and say with confidence what the mood of Russia is very ambitious. So,
I talked to RT journalist Eva Bartlett a few days ago. She lives in Moscow,
mhm.
and I asked her the temperature on this situation, and she said more and more people are discussing these things, and they are angry because they believe that the war should be sped up, and they believe with the loss of Russian lives that Russia should just go and crush um, um, Ukraine and not deal with the United States in the way that it once did. And she says that's starting to be the talk around parts of Russia. Uh, do you think that those are legitimate aspirations of some of the people? Because a lot of people are pissed over the fact that not only was this an unprovoked war by Russia, because Russia didn't provoke this war. They, for years and for decades, they continued to talk to the West, but the United States is an empire and it continues to expand. It needs to expand to keep the empire going, and for them to arm, train, and then give political cover to Ukraine and NATO proxies in there. do you think that it would be a smart move by Russia to negotiate with the very people who caused it and who are arming and giving real time intelligence and maintaining the war? Because if they negotiate an end to this, who's to say that they will honor it, even with verification, certain verifications, because there are long borders and they can pump weapons in, and they could use guerrilla warfare tactics to keep Russia bleeding slowly.
Well, let me first clarify that um, I personally have said uh, on air and in my publications that I am disappointed that Mr. Putin has shown, talked about his wonder weapons, like the Oreshnik, or now this Poseidon and Borovyesnik, wonderful weapons ahead of the West. He doesn't use them. I do not. I go back to what Mr. Putin himself said 16 months ago, when the issue of long-range American missiles was first raised, and he said that if they're introduced, then uh, we will have to attack the suppliers. He said that from the beginning, if Russia's security interests are violated, then Russia will have to attack the decision-making centers in Kiev. It hasn't happened. It is for me unfathomable why he believes that talking and showing off weapons uh, provides deterrence power when you let your enemy cross all of your red lines.
Mhm.
That's a contradiction which is unacceptable. It denies you the value of deterrence. Deterrence is when you use those weapons to blast the enemy out of existence. And I don't mean the whole city of Kiev. No, Russia uniquely has a weapon that can destroy one city block, for example, or one building where the government is. Why don't they use it? Why they don't make a decapitation strike against Kiev? I don't understand. Um, I have held that against Mr. Putin. But here we are. We are where we are. He is the leader of the country, and it's for him to discuss with his colleagues near and far uh, whether such a strike is worthwhile and will accelerate the end of the war. But I think that going back to where we started this conversation, thanks to the intervention of Mr. Trump, by doing what he can to bring down the Zelensky government with this investigation into corruption, I think that Mr. Putin's trust in Trump has not been misplaced. I think that I'm not talking about Trump's ultimate motives, how he wants to break up the very close alliance between China and Russia and so forth. That's a separate question. I'm not, or I do not believe any of his statements of a humanitarian nature. So many boys are dying and so forth. The man who has given us the genocide in Gaza is not a convincing spokesman for humanitarian concerns. There are issues of realpolitik here, of American interests, and that are separate, and where Mr. Trump may actually be acting in a reasonable way for American interests without being a warmonger as such. Um, on the contrary, I think his contributing in the way I've mentioned to bringing down the Zelensky government will have the effect of hastening peace. And and what comes out of the peace, look, it's up to the Russians. The Russians have won the war, and it's now up to them to win the peace. Just declaring that you won is not enough. You have to be. I was listening to a very interesting presentation, Russian Belarus presentation on BRICS and the multipolar world, and how it's coming in, and how BRICS countries now have 40% of the global GDP, and the G7 only has 23% or something. And this is a lot of self-congratulatory talk about how the world is changing and European domination is coming to an end. I don't believe any of that, and I don't believe it at all. The BRICS is so far a failure. The fact that it's a failure is demonstrated by China and Russia moving their eggs from that basket into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization basket, because that is controlled by them without the problems of Brazil and India, who are not terribly motivated to follow the solutions proposed by the initiators of the BRICS, Russia and China. So that's one element. The other element is, frankly speaking, GDP doesn't tell you anything. What do I mean? GDP is not hard power. The world is ruled by hard power, not by GDP. I had a debate, a little private debate, at a dinner party in my house with John Mearsheimer in March 2015. And it was about precisely GDP. I was explaining, as Mearsheimer, a realpolitik theorist, that Russia had no future, that Russia was a declining power. This was Mearsheimer in 2015. Compare it with today. It was declining power. The change took 4 months ago, 6 months ago, because he was measuring Russia by GDP. He wasn't the only one. The opponents to Mr. Putin in 2016 elections, the liberals, Yablok was the name of the party, were saying, hey, Russia, we're only 3% of global GDP. How can we even think about going up against the United States? Well, they did, thanks to Mr. Putin. And Russia today is virtually defeating NATO. Russia today is widely considered to have the second most powerful army in the world. Certainly the most powerful fighting army on the ground in the world. And still doesn't have much more than 3% or 5% of global GDP. So much for GDP being an indicator of hard power. So when you measure multipolarism by the GDP results of the membership in BRICS, you're way off base. Mr. Trump has done a hell of a job denting BRICS by his secondary tariffs. The Indians have stopped buying Russian oil, all because the expense to them of Mr. Trump's tariffs is much higher than the economic gain of buying cheap petroleum from Russia. So the United States packs a wallop. Going back to the question of the changing status of European domination. Wait a minute. There was World War I. Europe lost millions of young men. France and Britain, they were devastated demographically. Their hold on empire was greatly weakened. Did that end European domination? No. Still better, World War II, Britain was bankrupted. Britain in 1946 lost India. India was perhaps 80% of the value of the British Empire. The British Empire went under after World War II. Did that end European domination? No. So the situation today, where is the European domination being broken? On the battlefield in Ukraine. Russia is the biggest factor right now in bringing in multipolarism. And therefore, it deserves the complete attention of your audience, because what they're doing now is far more important than BRICS.
So, do you think that one of the reasons Europe is so invested in maintaining this war is because they stole Russia's strategic assets that they were holding, and they're trying to pretend as though that a lot of they still have the all of the so-called $300 billion?
No, I see it differently. Look, for me, the European leaders, 24 out of 27 heads of government in Europe, who are all locked arms and all conformist around the same hopeless, idiotic policies towards Russia and towards the world at large, those people are for this war because it sees they see it will keep them in power for the next 10, 20 years. We know that Mr. Netanyahu in Israel is destroying the whole region for the sake of not losing his coalition, not going out of government and being put in a prison. The European leaders are the same. They are preparing Europe to turn into one big Ukraine. They are, so long as they can keep their prime minister posts, have their secretaries, have their nice cars, and they don't give a damn for us, the people of Europe. There are a few people who do. I'm happy to say, to my surprise, that I'm living in one of those countries. Belgium today did a very big uh, act to crush von der Leyen and to change the political alignments in Europe. You know that von der Leyen has been working to assign the 185 billion euros of frozen Russian assets in Euroclear. There are other Russian assets elsewhere in Europe, 20 or 30 billion in France, similar amount in Britain, in various countries, they have frozen assets. But the single largest amount of Russian state assets that are frozen are in Belgium in an organization called Euroclear. And von der Leyen has seen that as a wonderful way to perpetuate the war in Ukraine for 2 more years. That amount of money would be enough to arm Ukraine and to provide for to pay the army and the bureaucracy for 2 more years. The money's going to run out in Ukraine for 26 in February. They won't be able to pay all their government employees. So she thought this is fantastic. It doesn't cost us anything. We're not stealing it after all. We're just collateralizing it. We're giving it over to the banks who actually turn out the money to deliver to Ukraine. The problem with it is that the money is in Belgium, and it is held in a Belgian jurisdiction, in a Belgian entity. And if that money or those assets are essentially confiscated, that will be challenged by the Russians in the courts. It is against international law, and the Russians will very likely win. This is not my speculation. It's the Prime Minister of Belgium's speculation. I think he has some good legal advisors around him. He has to, because if they were to sue the Russians and to get the money back, that is the equivalent of 1/3 of Belgium's national GDP. This country would be ruined, and he knows that. And unlike his fellow prime ministers, he actually is interested in his country not being ruined. Strange guy. And he told von der Leyen last month at a meeting of the European Council. But it's hard for people to follow these European institutions. But let me just say that there are two executives in the European Union institutions. One is the one we all know; it's the European Commission, and the other is this European Council, which meets like once a month, and is where the European heads of state or government assemble to make policy decisions. At such an assembly within the last month, De Wever was asked about this, and he said that he vetoes it because of the risks involved. And he will accept it only if all the European countries um, buy in and accept in a juridically enforceable way that they are also liable and will share the costs of paying out a decision against Belgium by the courts. A few days ago, von der Leyen came out saying, "Oh, I got it, I got it. We're going to get what you want. Don't worry about it, De Wever. We'll get the site. So let's meet, and you just say yes, and we'll take the money and already begin to collateralize it." Well, De Wever yesterday sent a 4-page letter to the public, which was released to the press. A 4-page letter to von der Leyen, which, to put it in the simple American vernacular, he gave her the finger. He told her that yes, all of these risks are there, and it's very important. I don't see any legal documents. I don't have anything to go by except your say so that the other countries will sign on to accept this risk. And then there's another factor here, Madam von der Leyen. What you're proposing will destroy the peace negotiations. The cat is out of the bag. That's what the whole thing was all about. It was to rush this seizure of the Russian state assets, to do it while the negotiations were going on, to enrage the Russians, and to frustrate the entire peace initiative of Trump. And now it's been said publicly, and there's no way she can argue her way out of this. So I would say that the notion of confiscating these assets is dead on arrival. It's not going to happen. The notion of Europe providing funds for Ukraine to survive 2026 is dead on arrival. The European, the Wever said, "Oh well, the alternative is that we can all get together, all 27 of us, pony up the money, and hand it over to Ukraine, 45 billion euros." He said that, knowing very well this is not going to happen. The German, because what's involved here would be a mutualized loan. That is a loan in the name of the European Union, for which all the member states would be responsible for their fair share. Germany is in principle against this. Germany has admitted such a loan only once in history, and that was for the recovery of the COVID pandemic. It refuses to do this for Ukraine. Moreover, the other countries also would face political death at home if they assigned taxpayers' money to extending a loan to Ukraine of this magnitude. So there will be no money for Ukraine, and it's the ability of whoever runs Ukraine to survive into 2026 is greatly limited. So you have that on one side, and you have the looming political collapse of the regime because of the corruption scandal, which is now at the very top. For these reasons, I expect a political collapse, which will be in Ukraine, not a military collapse, but a political collapse and a capitulation.
One of our viewers, Earthling 384F, has a good question. They said, "I wonder if that money," talking about the Russian money, "is in liquid assets or is it tied up in hard assets?"
If you mean by hard assets, gold, no. But no, I imagine it's in state bonds of one European state or another. That would be like in the States, the Russians and the Chinese all bought treasury bonds. It's probably that type of asset.
And closing, what do you think the situation will be in the coming weeks or months in Ukraine? Do you think a deal is hammered out with a total capitulation of Ukraine, or in a power vacuum, and Russia is openly declared the winner? Or do you believe that they will continue on with this game of cat and mouse on provocation and threats from the West?
Well, a lot is in the hands of Donald Trump. How well he succeeds in shaming the European leaders and enforcing a break of this linked arms nonsense, so that those people who still have brains, and to my surprise, Mr. Bartolomeo, our prime minister, is one of them. He's not an intellectual powerhouse, but he has enough brains to see reality. There are a few other countries, and they had been dominated by von der Leyen and the warmongers. I hope that in collaboration with Viktor Orban of Hungary, with Robert Fico of Slovakia, and other countries that have been quiet, the consensus in Europe will be broken. Mr. Orban has 25% of the parliamentarians in the European Parliament are in his bloc, or grouping of deputies. These are patriots of Europe. I hope that the collapse of Ukraine will precipitate a movement of other deputies from the major parties that dominate and have dominated the European Parliament for the last 20, 30 years. That is centrist right and central left. I hope there'll be defections from those losing forces in the EU to more common sense, which is where we began this discussion, and realistic appraisals of the way forward in Europe. The logic is that the United States abandons Europe's defense if it persists in waging a war in Ukraine. That the Europeans will be beaten badly. The Russians are not going to wait 3 years for Europe to rewarm. They're going to call for serious talks about security now, while they have all the advantage on their side. And there should be some sane minds in Europe, still a few, to agree to talks with Russia.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, for you coming onto the platform and explaining very well of your thoughts and your perspectives on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. I really, really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. I hope your audience will appreciate that we are also not locked arms in the alternative media. The best thing for the audience is to see different perspectives and come to their own conclusions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, and I'll be sending you the video in about 3 or 4 minutes as soon as the show ends.
Terrific. I'll be happy to repost it on my 2 platforms.
All right, stay safe out there, and thank you for everybody. I want to say to you all, please join us, and in about 30 minutes we'll have Mike Mihalovich on the platform in about 30 minutes. So come back to the platform. I want to say this, as I always say in closing. Always do right to others, not because there's some material gain or because there's some accolades or a pat on the back to be had. Do right to others because it's the right, the humane, and the godly thing to do. Because even when no one else is watching you, remember, God Almighty is watching you. As my late, great, and beautiful mother would always say, God sits high on the throne of power, but he looks low. Know that I love each and every one of you who loves truth, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that the true and living God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, remember to stay righteous, because that's the only thing that's going to get you out of here. Hey, mama, your baby boy loves you more than life. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Peace. We're out of here.
Told you to walk away. That was my first and last mistake. I'm blue without your face. But what can I do? 'Cause I'm just a